earlier in the war between Russia and Ukraine, I would frequently, before we had this channel, I would go on Fox News or CNN, MSNBC, actually not MSNBC, but NBC, several of these other ones. And I would always make the argument that there is no viable military path for a Ukraine victory, which described as driving Russia out of Ukraine, all the places that they had. That was what I said at the beginning. Now then, I've got a new question here. Is there a viable path for Ukraine to avoid defeat? In other words, is Ukraine winning is off the table? Just point blank. It's not even in the area of discussion anymore. But can they even hang on, or is the best that they can hope for a stalemate? Now, I've got somebody really good to help us dig into this today, because the answer is going to be, you probably figured it out already. It's not going to be a good answer for the Ukraine, but Jason Beardsley is going to be here to help us talk about this. And Jason's director of veteran issues at Stand Together. He's also a former Trump advisor and a former combat vet himself. Welcome back, Jason.
Well, great to be back with you, Danny. And maybe I'll surprise you in the audience a little bit by saying they've already won. And by win, I mean they've maintained a border sovereignty that they had in 2014. And if everything stops where it is now, they kept their country. That was not easy to do. And Russia rolled in, threatened to take the capital. They pushed them back. So in its own form, it's a sort of a sense of victory. But notice that our Defense Department, our White House, has not clearly articulated what does victory mean. And by the way, for those who are watching and paying attention, especially veterans who've done this before, we saw the same thing in Afghanistan. We saw the same thing in Iraq. We saw the same thing in Vietnam. They don't actually tell you what victory is. They just tell you to keep opening the checkbooks because we got to keep rolling down this program. So,
okay, fair enough. Definitions matter. So if my definition is of can they, well, and actually I think that's still an open question, is can they maintain that? Can they keep those 2014 borders, or the ones that they have right now? Even forget about the 2014. And I think here's where my position is, and we'll unpack this as we go through here. If we had made a negotiated settlement in March of 2022, when they had a chance in Istanbul, or even if we do it now, then they have a chance to actually have a win in terms of what the alternative is, which is a loss. So it's still an open question, but the longer we don't deal with reality, the worse their chances get, I think. What do you say to that?
I think that's the right question. And really, we can define this even better with what constitutes a significant loss. And I would say, especially for the Ukrainian people, what may constitute one of the worst things that can happen there is the loss of generational youth and men, and even women, civilians that are killed in this, but especially fighting age men. 1, 2, and 3 generations of that is a very long-term sort of loss for the country. So the quick answer is, the easier it is to negotiate now, or the quicker that you do this, the less you're going to be dealing with the long-term consequences. And let's make no mistake here, for the audience that may continue to believe that money is always the answer, when this thing settles, it's going to be a lot more money than we've been spending now for the reconstruction. That's going to be all in. Right now, it's all weapons and foreign military aid and assistance. But once this thing turns off, it's going to turn into reconstruction for the next 10 years. So there's still going to be plenty of money going the way of Ukraine. The quick question then again is, how do they get the most out of this that they possibly can? And the answer is, get to negotiated settlement now. It's not easy. People are not going to like that. Nobody wants to hear this. But we cannot be emotional or irrational about this because we don't like Russia. That can't not constitute what is United States national security.
Yeah, and that Gary's showing those scenes right there. That just that's just one city. Marinka is another one that you can't even show these kind of stuff because the buildings have been wiped out. It looks like Hiroshima, like there's not a wall standing in that. And those are just 2 of them that I can think right off the hand. That's why this is going to be, I bet, easily into the trillions of dollars, taking decades to actually accomplish after the fighting is finally solved by whatever means. And that hadn't even begun yet. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But first of all, let's look at the first question. Can Ukraine avoid defeat? Now, I think it is possible, as you mentioned here, but we're going to have to make some big changes, or we're going to perversely increase the chance of Ukraine losing. And let me explain what I mean. So first of all, I want to play a few clips here by Zelensky that kind of build an escalating picture that shows just how much trouble they're actually in. Here he is in early April complaining about the fact he didn't have enough air defense.
Є системи ППО у світі, які можуть допомогти. Потрібна лише політична воля, щоб ці системи були передані Україні. Зараз патріотам місце саме в Україні, щоб згодом не довелось їх застосовувати щонайменше по всьому східному флангу НАТО.
So, like he always does, he likes to say, hey, you got to give this to us here. Otherwise, you're going to end up having to fight Russia on the border, which is not going to happen. We can discuss that later if you'd like to first. But he's showing that he recognizes, because Russia has been on a methodical, strategic bombing campaign where they're knocking out energy infrastructure, weapons depots, ammunition depots, other kinds of even some of the places where the troops are housed, in depth, in the near to the front line, deeper from the front line, all the way to the Polish border, etc. And he's running out of ammunition. Now, after Israel was attacked by a response rather from Iran, after Israel attacked the embassy on the 1st of April, this past weekend, he was kind of pissed off. I mean, we've got to be blunt about it, because he saw how everybody came to Israel's help, to include actually knocking down missiles and drones of the same type, of many of which are hitting him. Here's how he responded after that attack.
The whole world saw that Israel was not alone in this defense. Do you think that the same message is being sent to the world about Ukraine?
I will give you one example, a very simple example. The Tropilska power plant. Electricity in the Kyiv region depends on it. 11 missiles were headed towards it. The first 7 we took down. 4 destroyed Tropilska. Why? Because we had 0 missiles. We ran out of all missiles. When someone says that our allies cannot provide us with this or that weapon, or they cannot be in Ukraine with this or that force because that would be perceived as if Ukraine is engaging NATO in the war, well, after yesterday's attack, I want to ask you a question. Is Israel part of NATO or not? Here is the answer. Israel is not a NATO country. The NATO allies, including NATO countries, have been defending Israel. They showed the Iranian forces that Israel was not alone. And this is a lesson. This is a response to anyone on any continent who says you need to assist Ukraine very carefully so you don't engage NATO countries in the war.
Now, there's very many practical reasons why the West would help Israel shoot down Ukrainian drones, and they wouldn't do the same thing for Russian drones. Same reason we didn't do a no-fly zone that he wanted in the first days of the war. Nuclear weapons are kind of a big one there. But the issue that we want to focus on right here is that he's right. They are running out of interceptor missiles for all the various kinds of air defense weapons that they have, because we just don't have them to give. And it has very little to do, if anything, to do with a supplemental in the U.S. Congress. And so given that, how do you see the air defense issue playing out in the coming days, regardless of whether we get this supplemental or not?
I mean, this is so complex, and it's got 10 years and 20 years of precedent to get to this point. The predicate here is, Israel has a different condition and different deals and national security structures with the West. Ukraine, on the other hand, has been a proxy of Russia for its history. And so to now foment this idea that they were supposed to have combat power enough to stave off the Russian army, the Russian military, would be predicated on the fact that they've been supplied by the West for the last 40 years. Now, there's been a lot of back and forth, and there's been some training, particularly in the last 10 years. We've had a lot of systems go their way. But the point is, to defeat a massive land army at this size, you're going to need to have industrial capacity that's been spun up for that for a long time. And now we're dipping into American supplies, and American supplies are actually on the wane because we've been at war for 20 years, times 2 wars, plus our manufacturing capacity is somewhat lagging behind. So we have industries. Our Army, Secretary of the Army just announced, I think it was a 5% cut in the armed forces for the Army because we can't recruit. Coast Guard shortfalls in recruiting. We're missing our recruiting numbers. Our Navy is inadequately staffed and trained. They're falling behind in the ship numbers. So the material labor and the let's call it the industrial base for our own country is already under question. But to fuel and fund Ukraine on top of that, boy, that's too complex. Now, what Zelensky's saying and what he's doing there is taking the place of a foreign policy advocate for himself, but putting himself in the position of a U.S. elected leader. We have our elections so that the sovereignty of the people can determine what is in the interest of America. It is not up to the president of another country. And for that matter, you can hear that even from our White House. They do not have the resources to give hand over foot enough to win, as you said, or reclaim territory that the Russians are vehemently defending. They've dug in their lines in the Luhansk and Donetsk province. They want to keep that. They've dug in their lines on Crimea. So to get that back, and you know this probably better than anyone, offensive military capability has to do with generating manpower backed with materials, supplies, intelligence, every combined arm battlefield weapon system that they have. And they don't have combined arms in Ukraine. The United States has helped infuse their strategies for the last 2 years with intelligence, with weapon systems, with air. All of this has come because of our generosity as the American people. But the point is, Ukraine does not have that organic capability. So that's why you see Zelensky saying, we don't have it. We want you to give it to us because we want to go to war with Russia. But frankly, even those in military command, Zaluzhny, who just left military command, is in disagreement with the strategy that Zelensky is putting out. So it's very difficult. We have to listen carefully to what the Ukrainian people are saying. And they have right now been under the pressure of mobilization after mobilization, and they're groaning. Fighters are coming back from the front line, and they're seeing the parties in Kyiv. They're seeing young, healthy men in shape who are cavorting and buying Ferraris while their guys are getting smoked on the front lines. So there's a disconnect that's not being told at the strategic level. And I will tell you, there are people from the ground that if you talk to them, they already know what the conditions are here. So Zelensky's playing kind of a cheeky game by trying to lay this on the West. That is not the answer here.
Yeah, that's such a great point you mentioned there that even if the U.S. were to go to war with Russia on a conventional level, if somehow you could keep the nuclear part out of it, we don't have the capacity right now. And to think that we're going to have it to give to somebody else is just unrealistic. Now, that would should lead to the rational conclusion that if you see the numbers simply aren't there, or that there's a math problem like J.D. Vance wrote in the New York Times last week, then you should think the wise thing to do is to seek a negotiated settlement. But when asked that same question by this interviewer, here's how he responded.
If you don't start to negotiate now, won't conditions just get worse?
I'm ready to negotiate now with you or with such people who really want peace. You understand?
Not with Russia.
But he doesn't want, especially Putin, all their narratives, the documents from our intelligence, what they discuss about. We have it from our intelligence. We have it from the United States. They know everything the same. So we understand that he's not ready for any negotiations. He doesn't want. He's not interested. For him, this is not victory. He needs victory. And for him, victory is to destroy Ukraine.
Okay, and here's what he's not saying, Jason, which is how my hearers hear this. I don't want to make a negotiated deal with Putin where I don't get what I want, where I have to give away all this stuff. I have to sign over what we already given away, what we fought for, what we bled for, and that we have to lose it. And then I have to sign an agreement. So I don't want to do that. But here's the thing, in my view, and tell me what yours is, how you see this. I totally get the hatred you would have and the anguish it would be to sign any kind of a deal like that to solidify what's already been lost. But if you don't sign a deal, that line's going to continue moving to the west until one day it's imposed on you whether you want to or not.
Yeah, negotiation power rests with let's call it the aggrandizing party, the party that has more power, right? That's where the negotiation always is. And by the way, there's a trick happening here that I think Americans have to be savvy about. When Zelensky or even our American politicians talk about this intelligence that knows exactly what Putin thinks, I'm going to tell you, as a guy that fought on the battlefield, an intelligence officer, special forces, a Green Beret, don't always trust the intelligence. It's not always right. And we don't actually know what Putin's going to be doing until we sit down at the negotiation table. But Zelensky's right. It's not going to be easy. and Putin's going to come in with demands. But that's why you bring multi-parties into this. You talk with Turkey, you talk with the United States, you talk with other allies that can actually get at the table and force by treaty a negotiation that is somewhat, let's call it at least appeasable to the people. That does not mean this was going to be easy, but guess what? When you're losing a war and you can't win it by math, by numbers, by the spirit of the people, by mobilization, by manpower, if you can't go and reclaim that territory, you don't have a choice here. But the one choice you do have is you either continue to grind a generation of Ukrainians into the dirt, and Russians too, and civilians, or you come to a conclusion that is not your favorite conclusion. Guess what? That's the world of war. And if you don't have the kind of power to go to war with a world power, don't expect to come out with world type conclusions. This is a battlefield. I've watched you, Danny, with some people in the elites, politicians, academics who just theorize because they want Ukraine to win that they can. But we're men who have actually put on armor and taken weapons into war, and we know that the conditions of war are complex. They rely on more than just money, more than just material. It's a combination of those. It's policy, it's will. And just as a reminder, I've said this so many times, Iraq and Afghanistan, we were the opposing force, and we had all the weapons in the world, all the money. We didn't have any shortness of supplies. But I'll remind our audience, we didn't win those. We didn't walk away with victories. We handed Afghanistan to the Taliban. We actually gave Iraq back to the Shias. They're now under sort of a proxy control of Iran. We did the same thing in Vietnam. We handed that to the North Vietnamese and the Chinese. So when our academics start explaining to the public without any detail how the win is going to happen because of magic thinking or wishful thinking, I'm saying don't trust them. And I'll take you to Arlington and show you the men who could stand up and tell you, if they were here, and witness to you that it has nothing to do with those political, pundits back in D.C. This has to do with men on the ground. And right now, Ukraine is not in a good position. By the way, reminder, 2014 is when the borders were where they are now. So if they stop now and negotiate a settlement that looks a little bit like what it is now, they're going to be in the same position they've been for 10 years. So that's what needs to be said.
Hey, except as you pointed out, minus a generation of men that they're going to need for the future. So that should bind it. Now it turns out that Zelensky actually isn't completely immune to math. He does understand part of it, as we see here.
Military assistance to Ukraine? I mean, has the well really run dry here, or what does it look like?
We have issued the last drawdown package that we had funding to support, and that's why it's critical that Congress move on that national security supplemental request and we get more funding. The assistance that we provided has now ground to a halt. The attacks that the Russians are conducting are only increasing. And now, as I talked about earlier this week, they're using North Korean ballistic missiles to do their dirty work. So the need is acute right now.
Gary, do we still have that video of Zelensky talking about if he doesn't get the supplemental, then he's going to lose? Do we have that one handy?
We have almost no artillery remaining.
Last month, you said if we have American support, we will win. If we don't have American support, we will lose. It's true.
Yeah, but see, here's the problem. He's partially right on that, but here's the problem: is that the math is also not working in the other direction. The belief that this funding bill is going to change the dynamics on the battlefield. First of all, let me just show you some talking about math. Gary, if you can bring up that supplemental bill, the picture of it we were talking about earlier. So this is what's in the currently projected House bill that's going to have 4 separate funding bills. On the one for Ukraine, it's 48, not 60 billion. But as you can see there, a lot of that money is going to DOD, whether it's for European command operations or replenishment of U.S. stocks, which may end up back in Ukraine anyway. But only 13.8 billion is directly for that. So that's not very much. That's not going to change anything. But here's the other thing. Here's the other part of the math. The Czech Republic earlier today said, hey, we have found even more ammunition that we're going to help provide to Ukraine over the coming months, up to 1.5 million shells, which is a huge amount. But no one's talking about that even changing anything. And so far on the battlefield, it actually hasn't. So if 1.5 million isn't going to resolve the problem for Ukraine, and it won't, then why is everyone hanging so much emphasis on this paltry little House bill?
Well, you can actually listen to the White House and, to kind of catch what's happening here in some of the Department of Defense. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about this is good for our defense industry. This is good for our companies. We're putting jobs in, Georgia and Wisconsin. So what they're really telling you is it's helpful for us to use Ukrainian soldiers, grind them down in a war with Russia to try to weaken Russia. That's the question about whether they've actually achieved that or not, because we make good money on this. They're telling you right up front what the purpose is here. And you've been very clever about this, because what war numbers really look like, again, is manpower. So when Russia's mobilizing another 300,000, another 400,000, the Ukrainians don't have it. So where do they go to get that? So now that if they're going to have all the systems, they're going to have all the weapons and the artillery and everything else, do they have the manpower, or do they have to impress more 65-year-old Ukrainians, train them in 2 weeks on combat techniques and strategy, and then employ them on an offensive campaign against a dug-in army? I mean, we're talking about some really nightmarish type scenarios. But the trick here is, if they can get you thinking about the money and explain to you why the money is what's at stake here, they get to spend more of your tax dollars. Meanwhile, and I got to go back to this, we had all the money on reserve when we did Iraq, when we did Afghanistan. It didn't win for us. And when somebody says, yes, if America supplies, if America backs you, you can win, you got to prove to me first that America could win in any situation here. Like, if we took this war on, would we win? And I'm not saying we don't have the best military in the world. We do. But the military, the materials, that's not what wins war. What wins war is crushing your enemy, closing with, defeating and destroying, fixing him on the battlefield, and ensuring that you break his neck. To do that requires World War II-like savvy, where you roll combat tanks across his terrain and you make sure when he pops his head up that you take it off. You don't leave the enemy standing. So when we did our wars, we weren't doing that. Notice how that worked out for us. You guys can just do the math. World War II, we had real combat power, we had real manpower, and we had real industrial power. We matched the three with political will, and we went in, we did devastation. You don't see that anywhere here. Now, I think
what you do see, and I just got to throw this in there because you brought the topic up, and in case anyone has any doubts about how accurate what you just said was, roll the tape.
Without sending a single U.S. soldier into combat and investing less than 1/10 of 1 year's defense budget of the United States, we have helped Ukraine destroy 50% of Russia's ground combat power, 50%, and 20% of its vaunted Black Sea fleet. Ukraine has taken off the battlefield 21 naval ships, 102 Russian aircraft, and 2,700 Russian tanks. By every measure, Ukraine's bravery and strength, its resilience, has made the United States safer.
I'm obviously not going to comment on private diplomatic conversations, other than to say it was pretty impressive tradecraft. The audio was extremely clear. Hello, how are you? Good to see you. We're here from America. Would you like some bread? Please take something.
Thank you for coming here. This was Newland and Pyatt visiting Independence Square in Kiev in December, handing out food to protesters and police. This latest episode is embarrassing for the US and allows Russia to argue that the opposition is being manipulated by Washington, something that Barack Obama has always denied.
What are you doing, Danny? You're handing out red pills, man. This is not the Matrix. You can't take everyone down the rabbit hole. You're talking Victoria Nuland in 2014 and machinations and 12 CIA bases on the border stoking war. I mean, are you trying to get yourself?
I don't mean to give you PTSD, man. My bad.
I mean, those are crazy clips, but what you're seeing behind that is an establishment in Washington who has no problem cavalierly throwing Ukrainians against the Russian army. Now, that's fine if you think you can win. If that's your policy, by the way, this is an old British trick, from the Empire days when they said, as long as we can keep Germany and France at war, we get to sail around the world and take all the cotton and tea and whatnot. So, empires oftentimes use others to fight their wars and keep people sort of sucked in. So look at China right now. China's a near peer rival, and they have the United States kind of locked into this monetary fiduciary responsibility of a war with Russia. Meanwhile, the Iranians are fueling Houthi rebels, and Iranian Revolutionary Guards Quds Force shooting at American soldiers in Jordan and killing them with the money that we're sending to Iraq. I mean, what you have here is cavalier politicians playing games with war like we're at a risk table. And these are politicians who haven't actually been to war, right? You have, I have, I've buried friends, you have as well. So we understand the risks here is if you're going to do this, like Winston Churchill said, war is ugly. It's deplorable. And you should take a long time before you go into it. But when you do it, you've got to do it quick and fast and get it over with. That's what makes it so ugly. What we're doing is hands-off proxy war that allows us to claim, you heard it at the top. I can't even believe that someone would say that. We've invested a very little bit of our money in retrospect or in comparison to the big bills. And at that, we've gotten the chance to beat the Russian army or defeat them, which of course is questionable because the Russian army's actually resurged. Their economy's actually resurged. They circumvented our sanctions. We're talking about repossessing some of their assets that are held by European counterparties so that we can pay for the Ukrainian reconstruction. Like, this is not hurting Russia the way that the American politicians told you it would. So I'm just saying, do not trust them. The only way you can get out of these situations is you've got to hold people accountable at the voting booth and ask hard questions. You talked about the supplemental. This is now moving through Congress, and everybody wants a piece of it because in their district is somebody that's making money off of the Russian-Ukrainian proxy war, and they like that money. So they are telling you, just keep spending. We'll get this over with. Notice the threats. If you don't do it, we're going to lose. There's going to be wars all over Europe and such. And Russia, being practical, if they couldn't take Kyiv, they're not rolling into Warsaw.
Right.
If they couldn't take Kyiv, they're not going to be threatening Poland. This is a fallacy, and it's a red herring. And again, strategies on the ground have to do with a combination of things. Ukraine doesn't have it.
Now, I want, just before we went on the air here, you and I were chatting, and you were talking about the pernicious, behavior or influence of money and politics and how it works on this. Before I ask you to share that again, I want to put it in stark contrast to what should be done and what would make sense by showing you a bit of a clip we had with Ambassador Chaz Freeman yesterday, or not with us. Sorry, this was with somebody else, where he's laying out there are 3 paths that we could go with Ukraine, and I'll talk to you on the other side of it.
We can continue to support Ukraine as Russia grinds it to bits and reduces it further in size and population. We can escalate the war, as French President Emmanuel Macron has advocated, despite the Russian threat to answer this with counter-escalation, possibly to the nuclear level. Or we can face up to failure and save what we can of Ukraine by negotiating with Russia.
So to do that, we have to, number one, acknowledge that we were wrong and that we've been pursuing a policy that can't win and isn't going to succeed, and it's going to fail with even more casualties being ground into the mud, as you have pointed out there. But in order to do that, you have to be willing to say, this is in the interest of America. But as you said earlier, there's an issue with money and politics. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, I mean, it's sad. And, this is a hard truth, but it is the truth. If you're running for Congress every 2 years, you're out raising money, you're fundraising. But on the other hand, if big defense comes in and cuts you a check for $2 million and says, hey, we got this covered, you don't have to do all that hard work. Meanwhile, every vote in Congress, they're going to lean on you and say, hey, what about this? And by the way, they're in your district, so it's jobs, it's economy. So a lot of people feel good about this. This is not to disparage the entire industry, but it is to show you the real balance sheets are actually there. This is business. And if you're not sure about that, just check the stock portfolios of your local congressmen and lawmakers, and you'll find out how much money they're really making. It's not coming off $124,000 salary up in Washington, D.C. But to get back to the point there, in order to really cut a deal here, in order to make everybody feel, this is 2024, so you can't say hard things to people. You got to be really nice. So you never want to say, hey, admit to failure and we lost here. That's not going to go over well. And the American people don't want to hear that. We got to say nice things like the victory here is that they've maintained their sovereignty. They've kept the country. And by the way, they did a phenomenal job of beating the heck out of those Ruskies, right? What a great job. And we can all celebrate that. Let these politicians have their win. Let's not hold them. I would love to hold them accountable, but let's let them get out of this thing so we can save Ukrainian lives, freeze the borders where they are, figure out a way to live in the world where some of our allies are not the best people. So, for example, we've got allies all over the world, I'll just remind you, that aren't really above reproach, and you could throw China in the mix and Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Remember, Turkey, they're buying Russian weapon systems and told us no when we wanted to invade Iraq in the post 9/11 wars.
Right.
So, we've dealt with belligerent friends before. This is not something we're unacquainted with. But if we get wrapped up in emotionalism and all we can see is how do we beat Putin? How do we beat Putin? How do we? I mean, my God, their GDP is like 1/14 of the United States. Like Mike Tyson doesn't need to come. I've said it before. He doesn't need to come down and fight me. I don't belong in the ring with that guy. But still, we have to incentivize the people here and give Zelensky a win. No need to embarrass people. Let him walk with the hero's bouquet, throw a big party for him and celebration. Get another guy in there that knows how to deal with both Putin and the West and says, look, I'm not going to be hardcore allies to either one of you, but I'll be friends to both. Because Ukrainian survival depends on someone figuring out that you live on the doorstep of Russia. So guess what? You don't get to throw big bona fides out like somehow you're a world player. We weren't going to let that happen in Cuba. So JFK didn't say, well, if Russia wants to sit, missiles in Cuba, that almost brought us to the brink of war. So when you reverse that psychology, what are we thinking that we might be able to do that in Ukraine? It's not reasonable.
Jason, what you just said there is makes eminent sense, because we always talk about you have to, if it's got to be the ground truth reality, or none of this stuff's going to work on the ground in the Middle East. Well, it also has to be ground truth reality in Washington. And what you just said there actually is a very plausible path that acknowledges political reality, that a solution can be found that even puts a Band-Aid on saving face. And a lot of times politicians, that's all they need, because they can't be shamed anyway. And they're okay with having the fiction here, but that would end the killing. But instead, this is where we still are.
We believe that Ukraine has a plan that they can execute to achieve victories on the battlefield. We've seen them having victories on the battlefield, most recently in the Black Sea, where in the last 24 hours they sunk another Russian ship. So we do believe that they have some surprises in store, and we look forward to seeing the results.
Jason, that's last month. That's not like early 2022. That's last month when Zelensky is telling you they're running out of missiles. They can't even stop stuff from coming in here. They already knew that. And he's Bill saying there's a path to victory. So let's just keep on going and give this $20 million. And so they're not even doing the face saving stuff.
You're trying to make my head explode. You got a State Department guy that's probably the closest he's ever seen wars from his TV, Netflix, or streaming some movie, right? And he's telling you that Ukraine, now notice he's a clever language expert, right? He said, we've seen victories. We're going to see more victories. Well, what's a victory? Well, if you define a victory as we sunk a ship, great. We'll see those all day long. You can have those for the next 20 years. And guess what? You're not going to reclaim territory unless something really drastic or extraordinary were to happen, like NATO jumps in with all its powers. Give me a parachute. Let me take Matt Miller over to, let's go to freaking Syria, and let's talk about how to win wars. I've been there, so I understand what the complexities are. Matt, save your opinions on this, right? Unless you understand what's actually happening here, and you don't care enough about the Ukrainian people to give them a break and stop pretending that you're going to hold up 65-year-old reservists who have 2 weeks of military training and go up against a formidable power. That's cavalier. We don't do that to our boys. Let's not do it to theirs.
Yeah, and of course he's just being the mouthpiece for the Secretary of State and the President, because that's ultimately the decision makers here. So this just, it's always about leadership. It always goes to the top, and it's just
be asking our State Department about war. We did that in Afghanistan, and somebody, made up the brilliant idea, Tony Blinken. How do we get out of this situation? Why don't we reduce the military presence while the diplomats are shaking hands and signing cards? Well, hey, my head's going to explode, brother.
Right. Sorry, man. Didn't want to have to do that to you, man. Do you got some blood pressure pills handy? Because I don't want you.
Right,
Anyway,
exactly.
sorry. I may need mine. But yeah, so that's where we are. And so that the whole thing, Jason, is just so egregious to me because I suspect you're probably the same. As a combat veteran, it anguishes me to see any soldiers pointlessly die on a battlefield, no matter where it is, no matter which side they're on. I just despise it. And when I see the political leaders really on both sides just keeping this war going, and especially on those that are on our side, at the cost of this blood, the pointless cost of the blood and the cost of their future with no concern about it, is anguishing for me.
Yeah, don't forget too, again, mobilization efforts, for those who don't know, inside Ukraine are schismatic. The people in power have exceptions to the people in their families who could get drafted, but the people out of power do not. And when they come home on leave from fighting on the front lines with the Russians and see that there's parties, there's people living the good life. If you go down to West Palm Beach, you're going to find a lot of Ukrainian, mansions and boats there. People are making money off this. This is a corrupt region. My point is, if you really care about these people, you've got to stabilize this any way possible. And if the United States does not lean on them to do this, it's gonna end even worse than it is. And if you love money and spending money on Ukraine, again, here's good news for you. When this thing ends, you're going to spend even more in Ukraine on reconstruction. So don't worry about the 95 billion supplemental. You'll be in the trillions within two and 3 years when this is over. So,
So final question here. If the Matt Miller version of that continues on, i.e., we're going to continue with the fiction and just la, 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 and not look at what's really going on the ground. If that continues and we don't do any version of what you described, how do you view where this war is going to go, say, through the summer? Because we had Colonel McGregor on earlier today. We had Ambassador Freeman on yesterday, and both of them think that if the status quo maintains from policy-wise, then there's a better than 50-50 chance that the Ukrainian army might collapse or break somewhere before the end of the summer. What say you?
I'm not as much of an alarmist. I think these things can burn for 20 years and simmer at the level that they have. You're going to have Russians making ovations of efforts to go west of the Dnieper River. You're going to have the Ukrainians sort of dug in. These are hardened enemies, and the more you fight an enemy, the more hardened they become over generations and such. So I don't think this necessarily means you're going to see a collapse in either side. But what it can look like is just an ugly, let's call it a simmering war that goes back and forth between these borders for the next 10 years. We remember this happened in 2014. They've been shooting at each other for 10 years already. There doesn't need to be an end to this. And this is where I think politicians sometimes get it wrong and make these mistakes. Like there's some black and white line, but notice that's never the case. We've seen this all over the place, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Yemen, whether it's in places like Syria. These civil wars can go on and on and on. I think that's the problem here.
Yeah, that is the problem. And it's for their sake, I hope that somebody finds the political will or the moral courage to finally do the right thing by the people of Ukraine. We'll leave it there for now. And of course, we're going to always continue to watch this. But thank you so much, Jason, for coming on today and providing these viewpoints and kind of laying things out. And hopefully we didn't raise your blood pressure too much.
You make it easy. We always have fun talking about the easiest things in the world. So thanks for what you're doing, Danny. Keep it up.
All right. Thanks a lot. And thank you guys for coming too. We remain unintimidated and uncompromised, and we're going to continue to bring you the truth that you need to make sense of the world around you. Thanks very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.